Hello everybody, Shrouded Hand here. I was recently talking to Reeves from the Paratalk podcast, and he reminded me about a story that I've always wanted to cover but never got around to, so I kind of took this as a sign to look a bit more deeply into it. This is the utterly bizarre case of Jean Hingley, which is also known as the Mince Pie Martian incident. Also, on a side note, I was recently a guest on the Paratalk podcast, so if you want to hear me and Reeves talk about all kinds of weird stuff, I'll put a link to that in the description. Go check it out. So, the case of the Mince Pie Martians. This incident took place in a small council house on Bluestone Walk in Rowley Regis, which is in the Midlands of England and pretty close to Birmingham. It was a cold, dark, snowy morning on the 4th of January 1979. It was around 6:30 AM. Jean Hingley stood at the back door of her house, waving her husband Cyril off as he left to work at the local cement works. This house had a small back garden with a shed and a garage at the end. After Cyril had left, Jean noticed that there was an orange glow coming from the end of the garden, and she assumed that he'd forgotten to turn off the light in the garage. She walked down to the end of the garden with her Alsatian dog Hobo, but as she got closer, she saw that the light wasn't coming from the garage. Confused, she and Hobo turned back to go towards the house. It was at this point that a glowing orange sphere appeared above the roof of the garage. This light, according to Jean, was bright enough to light up the whole garden, and she could feel heat radiating off it. Alarmed, Jean and Hobo retreated back inside the house and watched from the doorway. The sphere hovered over towards the house and settled on the lawn in the middle of the garden. At this point, its glow changed from orange to white. Jean then heard a noise, which in her original report she describes as sounding like Z, Z, Z. At this moment, 3 strange creatures floated into the house through the open door. She could see that these creatures were humanoid looking, and they were around 3 to 4 feet tall, but they emitted such a blindingly white light that Jean couldn't get a good look at them. They hovered about a foot off the floor, and they glided across the kitchen towards the living room door. Understandably, Jean was overcome with terror. She gripped onto the kitchen sink, and she said that she felt as if all the blood was draining from her body. She felt as if she was completely frozen in place. She also noticed that her dog Hobo seemed to be hobbling slowly, swaying unsteadily as he walked. All of the hairs on his back were sticking up, and he appeared to be in a daze. He hobbled over to his water bowl, then lay down on the floor and remained lying there motionless with his eyes open. After a while, standing there frozen, a change seemed to come over Jean. In her own words, she describes it like this: "The fear seemed to leave me. I felt as if I were lifted up. I wondered what was happening to me. I felt as if I was a different person, as though I was in heaven, although I was still at home. I seemed to float into the lounge. I held the door, but my feet didn't touch the ground. The doors were wide open, and it was a bitterly cold morning, but I felt warm." As she entered the lounge of her house, the creatures were in there, but the light emitted from them was so bright that Jean had to cover her eyes with her hands. She says that at this moment she had the feeling that the entities were probing her mind, and then they seemed to understand that the light was too intense for her. When she removed her hands from her face, the lights appeared to have dimmed, and it was at this point that she got a good look at the creatures. She describes them like this: "There they were, 3 little slim men in silvery grey tunics and silver waistcoats with 6 silver buttons or press studs down the front. They were about 3 feet 6 inches to 4 feet high, all alike. Their pointed hands and feet were covered in the same silvery green, and they had pointed caps on the head of the same colour and with something like a lamp on the top. They had transparent fishbowl helmets over their heads which rested on their shoulders. There were no eyebrows or ears to be seen. Their faces were waxy white, corpse-like, and they had black diamond eyes. I don't know much about precious stones, but that is how I would describe them. I didn't notice their noses. Their mouths were very thin. Their wings were wonderful, large, oval-shaped and glowing with rainbow colours, red, violet, gold, blue, green, but more beautiful than our earthly colours. Their wings were covered in dots, like braille dots. I thought of Joseph's coat of many colours. Our colours seem like chemical colours compared to them. She also noted that their arms and legs ended in simple tapering points with no apparent hands or feet at the ends. Each being was surrounded by a halo of light, and they had numerous thin streamers that hung down from their shoulders. When they moved about, they held their arms clasped tightly to their chests, and their legs hung down limply below them. So one thing I like to do when I get these descriptions is to stick them into ChatGPT and see what it spits out, so let's have a go. Yeah, I think we'll just stick to the drawings. A lot of these drawings come from the various books and reports that I've consulted to make the video, and they were based on Jean's eyewitness accounts. I think in some cases she was actually shown the drawings to confirm that they did look like the creatures that she described. The three beings were stood around Jean's Christmas tree, shaking it violently back and forth. They then floated around the room, picking up various objects and examining them. They touched all the Christmas cards and all the furniture. I think they had magnets in their hands because they kept lifting things that they had touched. She also noted that as they floated around, their wings fluttered gently, not in a flapping motion like a butterfly, but just a gentle flutter. It seemed to her like the wings were ornamental. They also made no sound as they flew about. Jean was again rooted to the spot, completely frozen. She couldn't do anything to stop their antics as they flew about the room. When she'd first seen them, she'd opened her mouth wide in a shocked expression, and now her face was frozen like that for a good amount of time. Eventually though, she seemed to regain her ability to speak. At this point she said to them, "3 of you and 1 of me. What are you going to do? What do you want with me?" The creatures put their hands to their chests, and they appeared to press the buttons there. There was a bleep sound from each of the creatures. Then 3 gruff, male-sounding voices said in unison, "We shall not harm you." The voices seemed to be coming from their chest area. They didn't move their lips when they spoke. She asked them where they'd come from. They told her, "We have come from the sky." In her own words, she says, every word they didn't understand. They did 1, 2, 3 ever so fast on their chests. Bleep, 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 bleep. I said, "You'll learn a lot of things from me with that bleep, bleep." And they said, "Yes, yes." Sometimes that bleep was very loud. It was such a high pitch it deafened me, because I had a lot of trouble with my ears a long time afterwards. The creatures began to shake the Christmas tree once again. This time they did it so violently that the angel on the top of the tree fell to the ground. Jean said to them, "We put up a tree at Christmas because we believe Jesus was born then." The creatures replied, "We know all about Jesus." The entities began looking at a newspaper on the coffee table. On the front of the paper was an honours list. According to Jean, they said, "These people have been made lords. There is only one Lord." They spoke to Jean about various topics, including Jesus and the Queen. She wondered why the creatures would deem herself worthy enough to visit, and she told them that they should go see the Queen or to see a real lady. The beings looked at Jean and they said, "You are a lady." The 3 creatures began jumping excitedly up and down on the sofa. Jean shouted, "Be careful of the furniture," and they stopped. She says that whenever she raised her voice, such as telling them to stop jumping on the furniture or chiding them for swooping around the room, they would emit a beam of light from their helmets, and this light would hit Jean between the eyes and momentarily paralyse her. Their manner seemed friendly enough, but she was aware that there was some kind of inner power that they had that could harm her if they felt threatened. Every time I asked them questions, they put the light on. They kept quoting me and putting the light on my forehead, and I said, "Don't do that please." But when they put the light on, it wasn't so very hot. It seemed a bit cooler. I said my eyes were sore and they switched it off. I said to them, "Why do you do that?" But they didn't tell me why, so I didn't bother them too much, because if I kept asking them, they would punish with this light. She said to them, "I can't call you creature, so I shall call you gentleman." And then she said, "Nice to see you nicely." In unison they replied, "Nice," and they began floating around the room again. The creatures floated out into the hallway and up the stairs. Finding all the doors upstairs closed, they floated back down into the lounge and they examined more objects. They picked up some cassette tapes and spoke to her about the singer Tommy Steele. They then examined the bottles of whiskey and sherry on the sideboard. Jean asked them if they would like a drink, and they replied, "Water." By now Jean seemed to have regained her ability to move. She went into the kitchen and she fetched 4 glasses of water on a metal tray. She reasoned that she should bring a glass of water for herself so that she could drink it with them and show that the water wasn't poisoned. She put the tray down and it seemed to slide across the coffee table towards them as if magnetised. She says that they looked like they were about to lift up their masks, but when they noticed that she was watching them, they emitted this dazzling beam of light from their helmets, temporarily blinding her. When the light dimmed again, 3 of the glasses were now empty. The next bit of conversation I'll read directly from the report. They said, "We've been to Australia, New Zealand and America. We come down here to try to talk to people, but they don't seem to be interested." "Shall I tell people on Earth about it?" I asked, and they replied, "Yes." They said, "We've been here before and we shall come again." Another thing they said was, "Everybody will go to heaven. There are beautiful colours there." They seemed to put a light on me to draw out the words that they wanted to hear. I was stuttering with nervousness. I was talking about politics and women going to work, and I said, "It's a man's world." They seemed interested and excited, as though they were listening and understanding. I told them that I'd not been to chapel for a year or 2, as chapels had pop groups and guitarists these days, and I didn't like that kind of service. "There is no need to worship in synagogues," they said. I didn't know until my husband told me later that this was the name of a Jewish place of worship. I said, "The Bible is hard to understand," and they seemed to know what I meant. Jean went back into the kitchen and she fetched a plate of mince pies for the creatures. I'm not sure if mince pies are a thing in other countries. They're small individual pies filled with dried fruits, sugar and spices. In England we usually have them around Christmas time. I don't know whether other countries have the same thing, so I thought I would explain what they are. Anyway, she brought the mince pies in, she put them down on the table and each creature picked up one of them. Again, the pies seemed to be magnetised to the ends of their hands. And then the creatures began examining a packet of cigarettes. Seeing their interest, Jean offered to show them how to smoke. She took out a cigarette and she lit a match. This appeared to frighten the entities. They started to back away from Jean. At the same time, there was a deafening beeping noise from the back garden. Upon hearing it, these creatures flew out towards the back door. Jean quickly stubbed out a cigarette and she called for them to come back, but they continued out into the garden. She watched them from the window. In the garden, there was an orange glowing thing which she described as looking like a spaceship. It was like a round cylinder with tapering points, or maybe it was more like a vase shape. The illustrations of this thing seemed to vary. It was 8 to 10 feet long and about 4 feet high. There were round glowing windows covered with a shining plastic which made it impossible to see inside. On one end there was a short antenna-like stick which had a spoked wheel on the end, a bit like an aerial I suppose. A doorway opened on the side of the craft and the beings went into it, still carrying their mince pies. The door then closed behind them without a trace. The craft lifted up and a bright blue light shone out from it. This light flashed twice, which Jean interpreted as the creatures saying goodbye. Then the craft flew off in a flash. At this moment, her dog Hobo seemed to overcome his paralysis. He walked out into the garden and began to sniff around as if investigating something interesting. At first, Jean felt a sense of calm and elation come over her, but then she was overcome with a terrible, painful sensation. When it was gone, I didn't drop to the carpet. I jumped, and then it happened. The blood rushed up, and I was in agony, pure agony. I was in pain. I didn't know where to put my arms. I squeezed myself. I was in such great pain. My legs, I couldn't feel them, and then I was wobbly and very, very weak. I grabbed the table. I slid my feet along the carpet, and I got on the settee. I didn't know how long I was there. Jean was so weakened by the events that she lay on the sofa for the rest of the day. As she was lying there, Jean says that she saw a tall figure in a white robe materialise next to the Christmas tree and then disappear. At around 5 PM, she felt like she'd recovered enough to get up. She went and spoke to a neighbour, and she told her about the visitors. The neighbour told Jean that she should report it to the police, which she did. The police said that they would send someone round. Next, Jean rang her husband at work. I rang my husband, but he couldn't leave his job. I said to him, "I've had visitors with wings." He said, "What do you mean, birds?" I was shaking and crying. I said, "No, men with wings." He laughed and he said, "Why don't you go and have your hair done and tell the girls about it?" The police did come round and they looked around her house. They noted that she seemed extremely pale, like she'd had a massive shock, but there wasn't much they could do, and so they called in a local UFO investigation team. This investigation team found a number of interesting things. Where the craft had landed in the garden, there was an oddly shaped impression in the snow. The snow here melted quickly and the grass wouldn't grow on this area for the remainder of the year. There was a circle of about 8 inches in diameter scratched into the glass on the window of the back door. Jean claims that this circle hadn't been there before the encounter. Inside the house, they discovered that the television set, the radio and the clocks in the lounge room were all malfunctioning. When they tried to play the tape cassettes that the creatures had touched, the sound was warped and distorted. Jean says that the tapes had worked perfectly before the encounter. Jean's physical health was also affected. She was left with hearing problems, which she says was caused by the loud beeping noises that the entities had emitted. Also, the bright lights had made her eyes so sore that she needed to wear dark glasses for some weeks afterwards. Her jaw ached from when she'd stood frozen with her mouth wide open in that shocked expression. She also had a general feeling of unwellness, and she needed to take 2 weeks off work to recover. She began to get extreme headaches, and a red mark appeared on her forehead where the creatures had hit her with the beam of light. After some months, a mole appeared in the centre of this mark. She developed a sensitivity to electrical devices, and she seemed to become able to read people's thoughts. A number of times when talking to people, she was able to receive a sort of psychic impression and tell them information that they hadn't provided her before. This happened to the UFO investigation team. She was able to tell them details about another case that they were investigating, even though she had no prior knowledge of it. Some other strange events happened in the days following the incident. A few days afterwards, Jean and Cyril's Christmas tree disappeared from their front room. It later appeared in pieces in their back garden, but it was missing all of the decorations. Over the following weeks, these decorations would appear lying on the ground just outside the garden. Jean also noticed that the gold of her wedding ring had turned white on the outside. Hobo the dog seemed to be extra sleepy for several days after the encounter, but then he recovered and was mostly fine. Although Jean's husband did notice that whenever they spoke about these creatures, the dog seemed to go into a sort of hypnotic, trance-like state. Jean Hingley was interviewed by police, newspaper reporters, and numerous paranormal research groups. Everybody who met her got the impression that she was being entirely sincere in her description of what happened. Her story was covered in a few tabloid newspaper articles. It was here that the story was dubbed the case of the Mince Pie Martians. Jean received some letters of support from people who had read about her encounter and believed her tale, but mostly she seemed to get ridicule. She received mockery from neighbours and work colleagues. According to Albert Budden's book Psychic Close Encounters, this resulted in her having a nervous breakdown and having to quit her factory job. I think things like this lend a bit of credence to these stories. Why would someone make up a tale that would inevitably lead to this sort of ridicule? And if you were going to make up a story about aliens or some creatures, why would you add so many silly details? Them having fairy wings and jumping on the sofa, that sort of thing. It should also be pointed out that Jean wasn't the sort of person who had any interest in UFOs and aliens. She was a deeply religious woman, described as being down to earth and entirely earnest. So, assuming she wasn't just making the entire thing up, I wonder what could have happened. Some have speculated that the encounter could have been a hallucination of some sort. There is a condition called peduncular hallucinosis, and this can be caused by strokes, brain tumours and infections, and it can cause vivid and colourful hallucinations. One case study I found describes a woman with peduncular hallucinosis who saw visions of animals and people that ranged from shadows to bright colours. It also included Lilliputian hallucinations, hallucinations of people and objects of reduced size. Although this report also mentions that she was aware that these visions weren't real, which does seem to be the case with most people who have this condition. Some kind of seizure is another possibility, as posited in this post on the Fractal Planet blog. They say, "My own experience with someone suffering a seizure is of their jaw being very sore in the days that followed, as a result of it having clamped so tightly shut during the event. An aching jaw was part of Hingley's after effects." The hallucination theory is plausible, but it doesn't account for the physical evidence, the mark left in the snow, the malfunctioning devices and tape cassettes, the circular scratch on the door, and the vanishing, reappearing Christmas tree. One theory put forward by Albert Budden in his books Psychic Close Encounters and Electric UFOs is that these events are caused by an electromagnetic phenomena that can produce physical phenomena like balls of light and malfunctioning electronics, but it can also induce strange hallucinations. Earthlights, as he calls them, are a luminous, energetic phenomena generated by fault lines and tectonic strain in the Earth's crust, especially in areas that are naturally rich in certain minerals. These energies, he says, can be amplified or triggered by man-made structures such as radio and television masts. It just so happens that right behind Jean Hingley's house is the Hailstone Quarry. This is a massive area of mineral-rich rock, and right next to this is a large radio mast. Budden suggests that a large amount of electromagnetic energy could be generated from the quarry, and then this could be amplified and directed by the radio masts, eventually coalescing itself into a large ball of orange lights that lands over Jean Hingley's back garden. This ball of energy could then have emitted 3 smaller balls of light that floated into a house. The shock of this sighting and the effects of the electromagnetic interference on her brain caused her to have a vivid hallucination of 3 small creatures. This could explain why a hallucination would leave physical evidence. Budden has written 2 books on this subject, and I'm sure me condensing his ideas into a couple of sentences doesn't really do it justice. I would suggest reading the books if you want to get a better feel for what he has to say, but I don't know about this idea. It's interesting, but I'm not sure I'm entirely convinced. It just requires such a specific series of events to happen in sequence. A ball of light generated in the quarry gets somehow blasted by a radio mast into Jean's back garden just as she happens to be standing there. I don't know, it seems a bit improbable to me. Others have speculated that these beings could be exactly what they look like, fairies, or at least some sort of elemental creature, maybe some kind of trickster spirit. There is a certain level of silliness to this encounter, and I don't mean that in a dismissive way. It's almost as if the creatures were saying, go ahead and tell people what you saw. Tell them you saw multicoloured winged people come into your house and jump around on your sofa and then steal your mince pies. Who's going to believe you? It's something you hear again in these stories about elemental beings, this trickster element. mischievous creatures using illusions and speaking in riddles to confound humans. People are still puzzling over this story 45 years later, so I guess if they were trickster spirits, it was mission accomplished. Sadly, 3 years after the encounter, on the 23rd of July 1982, Jean Hingley died. According to this article, she was a very active member of her local community right up until her death. She was head of the Portway Hill Tenants Association, which it says she ran virtually single-handed after giving up work 2 years ago. So although the reports of her having to quit work after her encounter might be true, she didn't become some shrinking recluse, but rather she devoted her remaining days to the betterment of her neighbourhood. There are multiple articles about her work with the Tenants Association. Interestingly, a lot of it concerns the quarry near her house, the same place that Albert Budden thought to be the catalyst for her strange experience. This clipping tells of how she threatened to organise a sit-down protest in front of bulldozers that were building on a housing estate near her home. She wanted them to build a play area for the local children, and she was concerned that the council had broken the promise to turn the quarry into a wooded greenbelt area. This story is from the 15th of July, barely a week before she passed away. Turning the quarry into a greenbelt would have meant that any future building developments on the site were severely restricted. It would preserve the area as a natural space. The Fae folk, they're often described as protectors of nature, guarding green spaces from harm. So it's intriguing to consider how, after her weird encounter, Jean became so deeply involved in protecting this land herself. Perhaps Jean Hingley's experience, whether it was fairies, or aliens, or just a seizure-induced hallucination, subconsciously implanted the idea in her mind that she should protect the natural world around her. Just an idea I had. Maybe a bit tenuous, but there you go. So that's the tale of Jean Hingley and the Mince Pie Martians. I'm not sure why I'm dropping a Christmas themed story at Halloween, but I hope you enjoyed the video anyway. Big thanks to everyone on Patreon who is supporting my work. Thank you for letting me make weird stuff like this. It's highly appreciated. I hope you liked it. If you're in the mood for more, check out that Paratalk episode I recorded with Reeves. I think we're also doing one for Halloween, so be on the lookout for that. The link to his channel should be on screen now. Alright, thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.